My well-matched childhood sweetheart fell in love with a delicate girl from the slums. To marry her, he faced immense pressure from his entire family and broke off our engagement. Heartbroken, I went abroad to further my studies. By the time I returned to the country, he and Carolina had been married for nearly 2 years, and I had long since let go of everything. But at the welcome back banquet held in my honor, the Patrick who once defied the whole world to be with Carolina now looked at the woman he had worked so hard to marry with cold eyes and disdain. He said in a chilly tone, "Aren't you supposed to stay at home? Why do you have to come out and embarrass yourself?" Chapter 1. When I returned to the country, my friends here prepared a grand welcome banquet for me. Patrick actually came too. 7 years ago, he insisted on breaking off our engagement, which was perfectly matched in terms of family background, just to be with Carolina. He even said in front of all our elders that if he couldn't marry Carolina, he would rather marry a dog than marry me. Such hurtful words showed no regard for the years of friendship between our two families. That day, I finally broke down. I cried for an hour in front of my parents, begging them to agree to break off the engagement. I told them I didn't want Patrick anymore, that I didn't want to marry him. My parents looked at me with pained expressions and finally relented, going personally to speak with Patrick's parents behind closed doors for an hour. In the end, it wasn't that Patrick didn't want me anymore. It was that my family didn't want to marry off their daughter. The situation escalated to the point where the engagement was annulled. Although our families didn't completely sever ties, our relationship gradually cooled. Later, I went to study in Paris, and now I've returned. I looked at Patrick. Compared to 7 years ago, he had grown taller and more composed, his handsome face exuding an air of noble aloofness. His dark eyes were fixed on me. No one had told me Patrick would be here. I turned to look at the friend who hosted today's event. Jessica quickly distanced herself, explaining, "It wasn't me who invited him. Sophia. Lee somehow heard you were coming back and volunteered to arrange this welcome banquet on my behalf." She then nervously added, trying to cover her tracks, "It really wasn't my doing." I didn't say anything, but Patrick smiled, his tone gentle, just like when he used to pick me up for school before things went wrong. "Sophia, it's been so many years. I was young and reckless back then, and I hurt you. So today, I'm here to apologize." He paused, looking into my eyes as he continued, "Are you still holding a grudge?" The way he phrased it made it seem like if I said yes, I would be the one who couldn't let go. So I lifted my head and gave him a bright smile. "You said it yourself, it's all in the past. After all, we're still in the same social circle, and it's been a long time. He no longer holds any significance for me. So, I let bygones be bygones, at least on the surface." I picked up a glass of wine and smiled nonchalantly. "Jessica mentioned that you and Carolina got married over a year ago. I haven't congratulated you yet. So here's to you." His expression remained indifferent, given that he had married the woman he had always yearned for. Even someone as reserved as he is should show some sign of emotion. Before I could dwell on it, he lifted his glass and drank. It didn't feel like a toast. It felt more like he was drinking to drown his sorrows. But I didn't bother to dwell on it. As old friends and acquaintances caught up, I naturally became the center of attention. With all the conversation revolving around me, someone asked how many boyfriends I had in France. Someone brought up my global art exhibition tour, and someone half-jokingly complained, "Really, Sophia, you're so accomplished. Your art exhibitions are always sold out, and you've opened so many galleries worldwide. My dad is constantly disappointed in me, telling me to learn from you instead of just chasing celebrities, shopping for bags, and buying sports cars." I laughed it off. "It's just a hobby." Patrick, who had been silent all this time, suddenly chuckled. "You've certainly learned to be modest over the years." His tone, how do I describe it? It was as natural as if we were still old friends, as if he hadn't said those hurtful things or done those hurtful things to me back when he chose Carolina. I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination, but I felt like there was a hint of something more in his tone, something almost flirtatious. Before I could figure out how to reply, he added, "I went to see your dream of samsara. It was excellent." At this, not only I, but the friends around me also noticed something was off. They fell silent, their gazes subtly shifting between me and Patrick. I kept a straight face and replied politely, "Oh, thank you." After a pause, I playfully reminded him, "Did you go with Carolina? By the way, why didn't she come today? It's been years since I last saw her." After all, we were classmates. His expression turned indifferent again, and he replied casually, "Oh, she had something to do at home." His tone made it sound like she was a stranger. I didn't understand why he was using that tone and attitude when talking about the woman he once loved so passionately, but I didn't want to get involved, so I laughed it off and changed the subject. After the gathering ended, we saw Carolina sitting on a couch in the lobby as we were leaving the club. Her eyes were fixed on the direction of the private VIP elevator, her expression tense and anxious. When the elevator doors opened, she immediately jumped up from the couch. It seemed like she had been waiting there for us to come out. Everyone froze for a moment. She tried to smile, her gaze sweeping the room until it landed on me, standing beside Patrick. Her face instantly turned pale. She stood there, staring at me, looking lost and forlorn, as if facing a great enemy. I was baffled. Chapter 2. Carolina has changed a lot. I remember the first time I saw her was when she transferred to our class in the second semester of high school. At that time, she was wearing the school uniform, standing on the podium, looking malnourished with her clothes hanging loosely on her body. Her features were plain and unremarkable, and her face was filled with nervousness and unease. The homeroom teacher, however, smiled happily and said, "This is Carolina, who always ranks at the top in the provincial joint exams. Let's welcome her." In the silence, countless curious eyes fell on Carolina. We were attending a private aristocratic high school, where everyone was either rich or noble, and academic achievement wasn't the only criterion for acceptance. Not to mention, Carolina's appearance didn't quite fit in. I found her a bit pitiful at the time, so I smiled and was the first to applaud. Only then did the class reluctantly start clapping, the sound gradually filling every corner of the classroom. The homeroom teacher smiled gratefully at me and pointed to me while speaking to Carolina. "This is the class monitor, Sophia Jing. If you have any problems, you can ask her for help." Despite these words, Carolina never sought my help, because she had Patrick protecting her. Patrick, who was my boyfriend at the time. When Carolina transferred, the only available seat in the class was next to Patrick, so she became his desk mate. I don't know if their betrayal of my feelings began to take root from that moment. For instance, Carolina came from a poor family. She suffered from severe hypoglycemia and anemia. One morning during self-study, she suddenly fainted, and it was Patrick who carried her to the infirmary. Or when Aunt Lee returned from Belgium and brought many gifts for Patrick and me. When she asked me to choose first, Patrick took out a box of handmade chocolates and said, "I'll take this." I was puzzled at the time because Patrick didn't like anything sweet, and I had never seen him have a special fondness for chocolates. Later, he even asked me for my family's pastry recipes. I found it troublesome and had our chef make them and send them directly to him. I thought Patrick had developed a new taste, until later, I saw the candy wrappers on Carolina's desk, along with the pastries I had sent to Patrick. It was Carolina who loved chocolates, and it was also Carolina who had a sweet tooth for pastries. I convinced myself that this was just Patrick showing concern for his poor desk mate, even though Patrick wasn't the kind of person who would kindly take it upon himself to help others. It's not that I didn't have my suspicions, but Carolina was just too ordinary. I never considered that Patrick would betray me and fall for Carolina. After all, I was so outstanding. I was the most beautiful girl in the entire school, and some people affectionately called me Three Goods, not because of a good temper, but because I came from a good family, had good grades, and was well liked. How could I have imagined that Patrick would betray me and fall in love with Carolina? But now, 7 years have passed, and Carolina no longer looks weak and shabby. She is dressed head to toe in haute couture clothes and bags, with large logos emblazoned on her, though expensive. They appear somewhat vulgar and out of place on her. She walked over to me, smiling, and greeted, "Sophia, you're back?" After speaking, her gaze hesitated as it moved between Patrick and me, a probing look that made me uncomfortable. I frowned slightly, feeling a bit displeased. Patrick was the first to speak, his tone indifferent. "Why are you here?" Carolina cautiously glanced at Patrick's expression, her smile turning somewhat pitiful as she tried to please him. "I was out shopping, and the club owner mentioned that you and your friends were here hosting a welcome party for Sophia, so I waited to go back with you." Her excuse was full of holes. She then raised the bag in her hand to show Patrick. "The manager here heard I was here and specially sent over 2 bottles of red wine, saying they were a gift for Mrs. Lee and Mr. Lee." She emphasized the words Mrs. Lee, as if declaring some kind of ownership. But Patrick's previously indifferent expression darkened with displeasure when he heard this. I heard a friend behind me stifle a laugh. Given the Lee family's status, it's not just the club manager, but even the owner would need to book an appointment half a month in advance just to see Patrick. Yet here was Patrick's wife, treating 2 bottles of wine from a manager as a treasure, and presenting them to Patrick as if they were something special. It was indeed a bit unrefined and unbecoming. Clearly, this sort of embarrassing situation must have happened many times in the year since Carolina married Patrick, because Patrick's voice was filled with impatience, and he was blunt. "Didn't I tell you to stay at home? Why did you come out and embarrass yourself?" Laughter came from behind me. Carolina's already pale face turned ashen, and she looked at Patrick helplessly. She didn't understand why Patrick suddenly got angry, nor did she know what she had done wrong. No one explained it to her, and no one taught her what to do. Everyone was laughing at her lack of sophistication and how she didn't fit in, but I was somewhat surprised by Patrick's attitude, and I instinctively turned my head to look at him. His face was cold, unmoved by the low, suppressed laughter around us, as if the person being ridiculed wasn't the woman he had fought so hard to marry. I was stunned for a moment. He hadn't been like this before. Back then, when Carolina was ostracized by the class for not fitting in, Patrick, who eventually broke off our engagement for her, stood up for her every time, protecting her. But now he stood here, looking down at Carolina with cold eyes, a barely perceptible weariness and impatience lurking in his gaze. He was like a completely different person from who he had been back then. How could he resent Carolina? Had he forgotten how he once defended Carolina so fiercely that he turned against me? Chapter 3. The first time Patrick stood up for Carolina was during an English class. For us, English was probably the easiest subject of all. Since the age of 2, we had several live-in English tutors at home, and all our daily communication was in English. From grammar to pronunciation, we spoke with the precision of British aristocracy. This was one of the basic skills we were required to have. That day, the English teacher called on Carolina to read a passage. As soon as she stood up and made the first sound, the class began to buzz. By the time she was halfway through, someone couldn't hold back and burst out laughing. There was no denying that her grades were excellent, but she likely hadn't received a systematic education, and her pronunciation was awkward, filled with embarrassing mistakes. The laughter seemed contagious, gradually swelling into a cacophony, until Carolina stood there, no longer making any sound. The English teacher, looking somewhat helpless, asked her to sit down and then tried hard to change the subject. After class, Jessica deliberately walked over to Carolina and loudly mimicked her pronunciation while talking to her friends in English. She imitated it so well that everyone nearby couldn't help but chuckle. Carolina sat at her desk with her head down, her bangs falling over her forehead. From the side, I couldn't see her expression, but her profile looked thin, her shoulders heavy with repressed emotions. I don't know why, but I suddenly felt a bit uninterested. I wanted to call out to Jessica, to tell her not to bully the new student. But before I could speak, Patrick, who usually didn't like to meddle in others' affairs, acted first. He had been lying on his desk, napping, but when he heard Jessica's mockery, he sat up expressionlessly, grabbed the thick book in front of him, Harry Potter, and tapped it on the desk. The thudding sound very clear. Amid that sound, he looked coldly at Jessica, who was mocking Carolina, and said coldly, "Shut up. You're being annoying." Jessica's laughter froze on her face, and the class fell into a dead silence. My gaze landed on Patrick for a moment. Then I looked at Jessica, smiling gently to break the awkward silence. I said, "Jessica, class is about to start." Jessica turned back and made a shushing gesture at me, nodding and pulling her friends back to their seats while obediently saying, "Got it." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Carolina glancing at Patrick, her eyes bright as she whispered something to him. I thought she was probably thanking him, but Patrick's expression was indifferent, showing no emotional reaction. Later, after lunch, I ran into Carolina again in the library. The library was the least crowded at noon because most people were eating, napping, or gossiping about the latest news. She was sitting in a secluded corner by the window, and I overheard her struggling to practice her accent with a small player. I didn't think much of it and lay down on the other side, ready to take a nap, until I saw Patrick. He walked in with his usual handsome, nonchalant demeanor, holding his English edition of Harry Potter. He walked straight to Carolina's side and stopped. He stood next to Carolina and said, "Practicing like that won't help." With that, he sat down beside her, casually opened his Harry Potter, pointed to a sentence, and said, "Read this to me." Under his encouragement, Carolina blushed and took a long time before she could timidly and haltingly read aloud bit by bit. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. Patrick's fingertip rested on drifting, and I could hear him patiently teaching Carolina how to pronounce it with a proper British accent. The library was so quiet, sunlight streaming through the large windows, illuminating the tiny golden dust particles dancing in the air, while those two, bathed in sunlight, looked like a painting. Of course, at this point, Carolina had nothing to do with it. She was merely passively receiving Patrick's help. But in the end, I saw her gaze fixed on Patrick's face, her cheeks gradually turning red. Then, in a soft, envious voice, she said to Patrick, "I'm really envious of Sophia." What she was envious of was obvious. From that moment on, I started to dislike Carolina. Chapter 4. Of course, no one could tell that I disliked Carolina. I've always had a calm and easygoing nature. Although my classmates looked up to me, I never engaged in forming cliques or isolating others. The first time I targeted her was during a PE class when we were practicing tennis, with boys and girls separated. Each person chose their own partner. As expected, Carolina was left alone. She stood in the middle of the court, holding her racket, her face flushed red as she looked around, helpless and pitiful. I smiled, walked over to her, and extended my hand, saying, "Let's be partners." She looked surprised, almost overwhelmed, and stammered, Me? I nodded and smiled, saying, "Yes, you." She smiled back at me, looking very grateful. I thought of the scene in the library with her and Patrick, and as I turned away, I wiped the smile clean off my face. I thought to myself, I hope she can keep smiling later. Carolina didn't return a single one of my serves. Like playing fetch, every time I served, I aimed the ball where Carolina couldn't reach. She scrambled, running back and forth, but could only retrieve the balls. As she picked up the balls, she kept apologizing. Sorry. I'm really bad at this." She didn't realize I was intentionally giving her a hard time until later when more and more classmates gathered around. I heard someone behind me whisper, "What's wrong with the school bell? She's never treated anyone like this before. When did the new girl offend her?" I smiled, pretending not to hear, and continued to serve tricky shots until Carolina stumbled and fell trying to return one of them. I stood there smiling, without a hint of remorse, and apologized. "Oh, I'm really sorry." She kept her head down, clutching her swollen knee, and whispered, It's okay." I smiled warmly and added, "Your tennis skills are really bad." During the group match later, "Don't drag me down, okay?" Carolina continued to apologize while struggling to get up. Everyone was watching the scene unfold until Patrick walked over. He glanced at me, then took the racket from the tearful Carolina's hand. Looking at me coldly, he smiled and said, "Her tennis skills are bad. Sophia, let me practice with you instead." Patrick completely overwhelmed me. To be fair, he used his left hand. He had won the junior tennis championship at 12, while I had only trained for 2 or 3 years to have something in common with him. My amateur skills were nothing compared to his. I stubbornly played against him for half an hour, barely returning any of his serves. I kept my eyes fixed on Patrick, but he didn't go easy on me at all. In the final shot, he served the ball, and it skimmed over the net, hitting my knee hard, the exact same spot where Carolina had injured hers. I couldn't help the pain. If someone hadn't gasped and held me up, I would have collapsed to the ground in agony. Patrick remained indifferent, looking at me coldly as he said, "Sophia, with your skills, even without anyone dragging you down, you wouldn't win." After that, he turned back to Carolina, gestured for her to follow, and said, "Come on, let's go." Carolina looked at him as if he were a prince on a white horse coming to rescue her. She obediently nodded and said, "Okay." Later, a few classmates took me to the infirmary, and after applying medicine, Jessica stayed with me. Jessica was usually carefree, but that day she sensed something was off. She asked me, "Sophia, is Patrick crazy?" She couldn't have known then, but what he did later truly was madness. But now, how laughable, it turns out he regrets it. It's absolutely ridiculous. Chapter 5. It was several days after the welcome banquet before Jessica dared to call me. She cautiously asked, "Sophia, are you mad?" I was mixing paint and casually replied, "Why would I be mad?" She stayed silent for a moment before sighing and asking, "Sophia, can I ask you something in secret? Do you still have feelings for Patrick?" Her question shocked me so much that I almost fell off my chair. After steadying myself, I asked Jessica with a wry smile, "What makes you think that? What did I do to give you that impression? Tell me quickly so I can correct it." She hesitated for a moment and then said, "Because I feel like Patrick, he seems to regret marrying Carolina. And let me tell you, before you returned to the country, Patrick asked me about you several times." She then filled me in on some gossip I had missed. Back then, after I left the country heartbroken and angry to further my studies, even though my engagement to Patrick was called off, Aunt Lee firmly opposed his relationship with Carolina. Patrick, it seems, truly loved Carolina. For her, he stayed in the country to attend university with her, and after graduation, he left the Lee family, refusing to use a penny of their money, and started his own business. To be honest, although we all felt bad for you at that time, we were also quite touched by how boldly Patrick stood up for Carolina. After all, it was true love. Later, the Lee family couldn't hold out against Patrick any longer. After all, he's their only son. They held out for a year before finally compromising and agreeing to let Patrick marry Carolina. But on the day of the wedding, the Lee family's reputation was utterly ruined. Although Carolina came from a slum, her family was large, and her parents, eager to show off, invited all their distant relatives and neighbors. Word spread that the Lin family's daughter had married into a prestigious family, and they all came in droves to the wedding banquet. At the time, Patrick probably wanted to save face for Carolina in front of his family, so the banquet wasn't divided into separate tables. The Lee family's relatives, business partners, and Carolina's relatives were all in the same banquet hall. As you can imagine, it was a noisy scene, with people loudly chatting, children running around and screaming, and Carolina's parents proudly boasting about their daughter's achievement in marrying the eldest son of the Lee family. It's said that one of Carolina's uncles, trying to show off, even made Patrick kneel and kowtow to him during a toast. Patrick, who is always treated like a star, has probably only ever knelt at the Lee family ancestral shrine, but now he has to kneel before an outsider. That night, Aunt Lee was so angry she ended up in the hospital. That was the beginning of his marriage to Carolina. After that, the Lin family frequently used Patrick's name to scam people, and Patrick had to deal with numerous tricky situations: Carolina's brother driving drunk and killing someone, her uncle buying a house, her aunt's children going to school, her disabled father needing a job. All these big and small issues piled up, gradually wearing away at whatever affection Patrick once had for Carolina until nothing was left. I listened indifferently, and for some reason, I suddenly remembered the time Patrick stood in front of me, explaining why he had fallen in love with Carolina. He had said to me, cold and deliberate, "Sophia, you were born into a life where everything comes easily. But Carolina, who had nothing, took root in the soil and grew into something bright and resilient all on her own. I truly love Carolina. I love her vitality and unyielding spirit." His words from back then were still fresh in my mind, but the admiration and love he once had were now almost entirely gone. What happened? Has Carolina's vitality faded? Or does her unyielding spirit no longer seem so bright to him? It's utterly ridiculous. I carelessly interrupted Jessica, my tone a bit cold. I don't care what's going on between him and Carolina. His affairs have nothing to do with me. I don't want to hear about them. And I'm not interested. Jessica, if you bring him up again in front of me, our friendship is over. Okay. Jessica quickly apologized. I won't mention it again. I just wanted what's best for you. After all, back then. She stopped herself from finishing her sentence, but I knew what she wanted to say. That back then, I had been so deeply in love with Patrick. But the past is like the wind. No one loves just one person in their lifetime, especially not someone who has hurt them. I'm still willing to exchange a few words with Patrick now, but only because I'm a gracious and dignified person. As for him, he means nothing to me anymore. If possible, I'd prefer to have nothing to do with Patrick and Carolina. But it seems that's only my wish. Those two don't seem to feel the same way. Chapter 6. I ran into Patrick at a business cocktail party. We're in the same circle, so it's inevitable that we see each other from time to time. I was feeling stifled and went out to the terrace for some fresh air when Patrick walked over, holding a glass of red wine, and started making small talk. I responded absent-mindedly until, finally, he turned his face to gaze at the distant, overlapping mountains with a look of deep melancholy. After hesitating for a long time, he asked me in a guilty tone, Sophia, have you been well abroad these past few years? I turned my head slightly, looking at him with a faint smile, and reminded him, Patrick, you're married. Given the moonlight and this atmosphere, do you think it's appropriate to start this kind of conversation with your ex-fiancé? My tone was not polite, but he just smiled as if it didn't bother him and said, it's just small talk between old friends. You're too sensitive, Sophia. I subtly retorted, sorry, but you do have a record, don't you? He paused, showing no anger, but instead smiled bitterly. He sighed and looked back at the distant scenery, saying, I'm just so tired. Everyone knew why he was tired. Patrick's choice of a wife had become a joke in our entire circle. A joke at the expense of the Lee family isn't something you see every day. I didn't continue the conversation. Instead, I calmly picked up my wine glass, ready to leave. Before leaving, I gave him a polite smile and said, but this is the person you handpicked yourself. We met again at Aunt Lee's birthday party. Since I returned to the country, Aunt Lee has often called me, even though the relationship between our families has gradually cooled over the years. There were still some business connections, and Aunt Lee had always been very fond of me. I could mock Patrick for betraying me, but I couldn't refuse Aunt Lee's invitation. She personally called me, Sophia. It's Auntie's birthday next Wednesday. Do you have time to come? You've been away for 7 years, and you haven't even called. When an elder personally invites you, it's hard to refuse. After hanging up, I went out to choose a suitable gift. It wasn't until I arrived at the Lee family's home that I realized something was off. Aunt Lee's birthday party wasn't a grand event. There were no outsiders, just some of the Lee family's relatives, so my presence felt a bit out of place. I hesitated for a moment, but Aunt Lee seemed genuinely happy to see me. She was surrounded by female relatives of the same age from the Lee family, Patrick's aunts and cousins, all of whom were familiar elders. Aunt Lee waved me over and asked me to sit beside her. I paused, not wanting to make a scene in this setting, so I kept a smile on my face, walked over, and sat next to Aunt Lee. I didn't see Carolina. Aunt Lee held my hand, carefully looking me over, and for some reason, her eyes grew moist. She spoke with emotion. This child has grown up before my eyes, becoming more beautiful and outstanding with each passing day. The people around her echoed her words, showering me with compliments. Listening to their praise, Aunt Lee smiled and reminisced. The first time I saw this child, she was 5 years old. Her parents brought her over to our house next door, dressed in a pink tutu, smiling sweetly as her mother led her to give us a neighborly gift. I remember thinking at the time, why didn't I have a daughter like her? In this kind of situation, I didn't need to say much, just keep silent and smile at the appropriate moments. Patrick and Carolina returned during dinner. Patrick probably knew I was there, so he didn't seem surprised and nodded at me. But Carolina, on the other hand, turned pale as soon as she saw me. Looking distraught, she forced a smile and greeted Aunt Lee. "Mom, happy birthday." Aunt Lee glanced at her, her face cold as ice, and didn't respond at all. Instead, she took my hand and led me to the dining room, saying, "Good girl, come sit with Auntie." By this point, even if I were dense, I could tell something wasn't right. The awkwardness reached its peak during the meal because all the dishes in front of me were ones I used to love. Aunt Lee introduced them one by one with a pained expression. "You poor child. You must have had a tough time abroad. You've lost so much weight. Try this clear soup with bird's nest. It was your favorite when you were little. Every time Patrick made you angry, he would use this dish to coax you. Lou, our head chef, knew it was for you, so he started soaking the bird's nest 4 or 5 days in advance. Try it and see if it's still the same taste." Crash, a loud noise interrupted Aunt Lee's words. I looked up to see that Carolina, perhaps distracted or nervous, had knocked over her plate. A servant stepped forward to clean up, but for some reason, Carolina insisted on doing it herself, crouching down with a napkin in hand, apologizing frantically. I'm sorry. As she was about to crouch under the table to clean up, Patrick grabbed her hand, stopping her. He looked at her coldly and said, "Enough. Look at yourself. What are you doing?" He turned to the servant beside him and ordered, "Housekeeper, clean this up." Aunt Lee, clearly furious, was breathing heavily. I heard her muttering, "What a disgrace. What a disgrace. Thank goodness it's just family here, and the doors are closed." She turned to me and said, "Sophia, just look at this. Look at this." She must have been really upset because she didn't hold back at all, directly and bluntly saying, right in front of Carolina, "If Patrick had married you, none of this would have happened." She clutched her chest, probably feeling the pain from her anger, and held onto my hand, speaking impulsively, Sophia, I remember you used to love Patrick very much. This foolish boy hurt you, but the past is like the wind. Can you forgive him? For Auntie's sake, can you forgive him this once?" The entire dining room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Everyone's eyes were on me. Even Patrick's. He had no reaction to his mother's words spoken in front of his wife. He just looked at me quietly, as if waiting for my answer. Carolina ran out crying, but no one went after her. I slowly placed my chopsticks on the table, smiled, and said to Aunt Lee, "Auntie, you didn't throw a big party for your birthday, yet you invited me, and I'm very happy. You loved me the most when I was a child. Even after Patrick betrayed me, I never forgot your kindness to me. Today is your birthday, and as a junior, I should be doing my best to make you happy. But the question you just asked me is really difficult to answer." I paused, smiled gracefully, and addressed everyone's gaze, then finally said, "Auntie, I'm sorry, but I came back this time to introduce my boyfriend to my family. I'm getting engaged, and since you watched me grow up, no matter what, I hope you can be there to witness my happiness." The room was silent. Aunt Lee looked at me in shock, and after a long while, she finally asked, Why haven't I heard anything about this?" She paused for a long time before asking, "Which family's young man is so lucky?" I lowered my eyes and replied, "The eldest son of the Sioux family, David." I heard a sharp intake of breath, and Aunt Lee was speechless for a long time. It was Patrick's aunt who broke the silence, smiling as she said, "Now that's a well-matched pair, a perfect union. Sophia is truly blessed." I just smiled without saying anything. Patrick looked at me, his face showing no emotion, but his eyes were complicated. After a long pause, he smiled at me, a little self-mockingly, and said, "Congratulations." I nodded gracefully and smiled back. "Thank you." Chapter 7. The matters related to the Lee family finally came to an end, and after that, Aunt Lee stopped calling me. I heard she ended up spending some time in the hospital again. The last time I saw Carolina was at my gallery. I was chatting with Jessica when my assistant came in to tell me that someone wanted to buy one of my paintings at a high price but wanted to talk to me first. When I went out, I saw Carolina standing in front of one of my paintings, hearing footsteps. She turned to look at me. It was strange. My impression of her had always been that of a timid, awkward person who never knew what to do with her hands and feet. But when it was just the two of us, all that nervousness and anxiety seemed to disappear, replaced by a deep-seated hatred. She looked at me and asked, "Sophia, you're watching my downfall, aren't you?" I laughed. To be honest, I have a lot to do every day and meet many people. I don't have time to focus on someone I never really cared about. I replied calmly, "You're overthinking it." She looked at me, and for some reason, she suddenly covered her face and started crying. "Do you know, Patrick is planning to divorce me? I heard him talking to a divorce lawyer. He doesn't want me anymore. I don't understand why. You're already getting engaged. So why would he want to divorce me? What did I do wrong? My only fault is my background. I don't have a family or education like yours. You all think I'm a joke, that I don't belong. But how is that my fault? I wanted to be like you too, to have a prominent family and be liked by everyone. But I wasn't born into a family like yours. You only have a better life because of where you were born. If we had started on the same level, I wouldn't be in this embarrassing situation. If you were me, you'd end up where I am now. In the end, it's all because of your family." She cried bitterly, but fortunately, there was no one else in the gallery at the time. I didn't want to deal with her, but she clearly wasn't going to leave until she finished crying. I figured these thoughts and grievances had been bottled up inside her for a long time, and she needed to vent them somewhere, even if it was to me. I thought about how she used to act so humble and eager to please everyone at the Lee family's home, and I sighed. I said, "Carolina, you're wrong. If I were you, I wouldn't have ended up in your situation. First, I remember your grades were excellent back then. If I were you, I wouldn't have stayed at the Lee family's home after graduating from university, relying on them for support. I would have used their connections and resources to start my own business. Second, you say your family is poor and you didn't have the same education as me. If I were you, after marrying Patrick, I would have learned social etiquette, how to interact with people, and how to dress well. I would have observed more, listened more, and spoken less. But unfortunately, you've been married to Patrick for almost 2 years, and compared to 7 years ago, I haven't seen any improvement in you. Third, I wouldn't have let my entire family openly and shamelessly leech off the Lee family. Your family is supposed to be your support system, but instead, they're like parasites clinging to the Lee family. How can you expect them to respect you?" What I said was meddling, and why I even bothered to give Carolina advice, I couldn't say. Maybe it was because of that Carolina who stood nervously on the podium all those years ago, trying so hard to fit into a new environment, trying so hard to carve out her own path through learning and hard work. But seeing her now, I didn't know what to say. Carolina lowered her hands from her face, her tear-streaked face clearly visible. She was still sobbing, but it was as if a drowning person had caught sight of a life buoy. Her eyes lit up a little as she asked, If I do what you say now, is there still hope?" She truly was hopeless. Her last glimmer of hope in the Lee family relied entirely on Patrick's love, and now that even Patrick wanted to abandon her, trying to do what she should have done 2 years ago was already too late. I looked at her with pity, thinking I might as well do a good deed for my own peace of mind. I advised her, "You said Patrick is already contacting a divorce lawyer." "Carolina, if I were you, I'd take the initiative to ask for a divorce. You have a prenuptial agreement with Patrick, and if the Lee family sees that you're sensible and know when to retreat, they might feel guilty and give you a bit more compensation." She shook her head, laughing and crying at the same time, looking at me. No, Sophia Jing, there's still hope for Patrick and me. We can still make it." After saying this, she turned and hurriedly left, probably to make one last effort to save her marriage. Jessica came out from behind me and said, "I thought you hated her." I turned back and smiled at Jessica. I never considered her my rival. I just pity her life. She treated Patrick as the biggest trump card to change her fate. She seized the opportunity and married him, but she forgot that her greatest trump card should have been a consistent and continuous effort to invest in herself. Life is shaped by the continuous choices we make. What is fate? It's the result that comes from all the choices you've made over time. Carolina blames everything on her background. But she's wrong. She ended up where she is today because, at every crossroad in life, she made the wrong choice. Chapter 8. Later. I heard that the Lee family's divorce dragged on for a long time because Carolina refused to agree to it. It was a noisy, embarrassing spectacle, and everyone in our circle had a laugh at it a few times. Eventually, the noise died down, and how it was resolved remained unknown to outsiders. A year later, when I got engaged, the Lee family attended the event. I saw Patrick with his fiancée, the daughter of a well-known CEO who owned a chain of cake shops. The two of them were a perfect match, both from prestigious families. Everyone was all smiles, congratulating Patrick. They stood together, sharing common topics of conversation, and no one made any careless remarks that might cause embarrassment. No one mentioned Carolina, who had married into high society only to become a laughingstock. She disappeared from our circle completely, as if she had never existed. Everything was elegant and graceful. As I held a glass of champagne and watched everyone dancing in the garden, my fiancé walked over, placed his hand on my shoulder, and affectionately asked, "What are you thinking about?" I smiled and replied, "Nothing."